In 2013, a young company called Zenefits was building something that the American small business community genuinely needed. A platform that would take the administrative nightmare of HR, health insurance, payroll, compliance, benefits administration, and make it free. Not cheap, free. The business model was elegant. Zenefits would give companies access to its HR software at no charge, and make money by acting as the broker on the health insurance policies those companies purchased through the platform. The software was the hook. The brokerage commissions were the revenue. It was brilliant. It was solving a real problem. Small businesses across America were spending enormous amounts of time and money on HR administration that Zenefits could automate. The product worked. The customers came. And then they kept coming, faster than almost any enterprise software company in history. At its peak growth rate, Zenefits was adding customers at a pace that made even the most seasoned Silicon Valley observers pause. The company was doubling, then tripling its employee count in single years. The ARR, annual recurring revenue, was climbing so fast that the financial projections looked like a graph someone had accidentally tilted. Andreessen Horowitz, one of the most prestigious venture capital firms in the world, invested at valuations that climbed from tens of millions to over $4 billion in what felt like an eye blink. $4 billion? For a company that was barely 3 years old. But here's the thing about Zenefits that made it different from the normal story of startup hype outrunning reality. The specific rule it broke was not an accounting trick or a financial illusion. It was something more concrete, more human, and in some ways, more revealing. To sell health insurance in the United States, you need a license, a real, state-issued, legally required insurance broker's license. You need to pass an exam, you need to complete approved training hours. You cannot legally sell health insurance policies to businesses and individuals if you don't have that license. Zenefits knew this. And Zenefits, according to the investigations that followed, built a system to fake it. Not to get around it, not to lobby to change it, not to argue in court that the regulation was outdated. To fake it. To build software specifically designed to make it appear that employees had completed the required training hours when they had not. To manufacture the appearance of compliance while conducting business that required genuine compliance. That decision, that specific, operational, deliberate decision, is the beginning of a story that ends with a $4 billion company worth a fraction of that. A CEO who became simultaneously a cautionary tale and a cultural icon, and a reckoning that the startup world is still, in some ways, processing. Let's go back to where it started. Parker Conrad is not a villain. This is important to establish at the beginning because the story of Zenefits can be told in ways that reduce him to one, and reducing him to one makes the story less useful than it could be. He is something more complicated, a founder with a genuine insight, genuine intelligence, genuine drive, and a specific relationship to rules and constraints that proved, in combination with extraordinary growth pressure and a culture he created, catastrophic. Conrad grew up in New York, went to Harvard, studied chemistry, and came to Silicon Valley through a path that included several early startup experiences before Zenefits. His previous company, Sigfig, was a financial software platform that he left under difficult circumstances, the kind of departure that in a smaller startup world with less money at stake might not have followed him. In the world of venture capital, where the game is finding the next big thing, and where founders who have failed are sometimes more attractive than founders who haven't tried, it followed him in ways that were manageable. He founded Zenefits in 2012 with Lax Srini, a technical co-founder, who would build the platform while Conrad focused on the business and product vision. The insight they were building around was simple and correct. For small and medium-sized businesses in America, HR was a disaster. The average small business owner, a dentist running a 3-person practice, a restaurant with 15 employees, a small tech company with 25 staff, was spending hours every month on benefits enrollment, insurance renewals, compliance paperwork, and employee onboarding that had nothing to do with the actual business they were trying to run. The existing solutions were inadequate. Traditional HR software was expensive, complicated, and designed for large enterprises. Insurance brokers were analog, commission-driven, and not particularly interested in the complexity of small business benefits for the modest commissions those accounts generated. Payroll providers were fragmented. The whole ecosystem was a mess. Zenefits proposed to clean it up with a single integrated platform. Onboarding a new employee would take minutes rather than hours. The platform would handle the insurance enrollment, the payroll setup, the equity grant paperwork, the compliance forms, all of it in a single workflow. The HR software was free because Zenefits would collect commissions when companies chose insurance plans through the platform. The business model aligned customer value with company revenue. The more useful the software, the more insurance was purchased through it, the more money Zenefits made. The Y Combinator Accelerator, which had funded Google, Dropbox, Airbnb, and dozens of other iconic companies, accepted Zenefits into its summer 2013 batch. The YC stamp of approval was not just funding, it was a signal to the broader investment community that someone with excellent pattern recognition had looked at Zenefits and decided it was special. The growth after YC was stunning. Not gradual, not linear, explosive. The company went from a handful of customers to hundreds to thousands in a matter of months. Small businesses that tried the product found that it genuinely worked, genuinely saved them time, and genuinely cost them nothing. The referral dynamics were powerful. A business owner who saved 12 hours a month on HR administration told other business owners, who told others. The product's fundamental value proposition was strong enough to generate organic growth that made the numbers climb in ways that attracted attention from the highest tier of the venture capital world. Andreessen Horowitz led a Series A round, then a Series B. The valuations climbed. By 2015, Zenefits had raised over $580 million in total funding and was valued at approximately $4.5 billion. It was one of the fastest companies in history to reach unicorn status. Parker Conrad was on the covers of business magazines. The company was held up as a model of how software could disrupt entrenched industries by making the existing players' cost structures irrelevant. And inside the company, something was going very wrong. Not with the product, with the culture built around making the product grow. Let's be specific about the legal landscape in which Zenefits was operating, because the specificity matters for understanding what the company allegedly did and why. Health insurance brokerage in the United States is regulated at the state level. Each of the 50 states has its own licensing requirements for individuals and companies that wish to sell, broker, or advise on health insurance products. These requirements typically involve completing a specified number of training hours in an approved course, passing a licensing examination, paying a licensing fee, and submitting to ongoing continuing education requirements to maintain the license. The requirements exist for reasons that are, in the abstract, entirely reasonable. Health insurance is a complex financial product with significant implications for the people who purchase it. The person selling it or advising on it is in a position to significantly affect the purchaser's financial security and healthcare access. Licensing requirements are designed to ensure that people in that position have at least a baseline understanding of the products they're selling, the regulations governing them, and the ethical obligations they owe to their clients. For a traditional insurance broker with a small book of business, obtaining and maintaining these licenses is a manageable, if administratively irritating requirement. You take the course, you pass the exam, you pay the fee, you do the continuing education. For a company growing at Zenefits' pace, onboarding hundreds of new business customers per week, each of which required an insurance broker relationship in the state where that business was located, the licensing requirements were a serious operational constraint. To serve a new customer in California, Zenefits needed a licensed broker for California. For a new customer in Texas, a Texas license. For Washington State, a Washington license. The licensing requirements in each state applied to the individual employees who were conducting the brokerage functions, not just the company entity. Zenefits was hiring sales and customer success employees at a rate that was, by design, aggressive. The growth targets Conrad had committed to required rapid staff expansion, and those new staff members needed to obtain their insurance licenses before they could legally work with customers on insurance matters. The licensing process took time, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, depending on the state and the individual's progress through the required training. Time was the thing Zenefits could not afford. The growth targets were not being met with licensed employees gradually working through their training courses. The targets required people working now, with customers now, generating revenue now. The licensing timeline and the growth timeline were in direct conflict. The solution that Zenefits allegedly implemented was not to slow down growth to match the licensing pace. It was not to redesign the business model to address the constraint. It was to circumvent the constraint through a piece of software. What investigators from the California Department of Insurance and subsequently the Washington State Office of the Insurance Commissioner found, and what a forensic investigation commissioned by Zenefits' own board later confirmed, was that Zenefits had built and distributed to its employees software that was specifically designed to cheat on the online training courses required for insurance licensing. The software allegedly allowed employees to appear to be completing the required training hours while actually bypassing or compressing them, clicking through course content at a speed that was not possible for a human actually reading and absorbing the material, or logging completion of course hours without actually completing them. The estimated number of Zenefits employees who had obtained or renewed insurance licenses through a process that used this software and who were therefore potentially operating as insurance brokers without having completed the legally required training was in the hundreds. The number of states affected was reportedly close to all 50. Hundreds of employees, all 50 states. The systematic, allegedly intentional circumvention of a requirement that existed specifically to protect the customers those employees were serving. This was not corner cutting. This was a program. To understand why hundreds of employees apparently participated in, or at minimum acquiesced to, an arrangement that involved systematically cheating on licensing requirements, you need to understand the culture that Parker Conrad built. Zenefits' culture during its period of explosive growth was, by the accounts of the many former employees who have spoken about it, one of the more extreme examples of the move fast, break things ethos that characterized the most aggressive Silicon Valley startups of the 2010s. The culture was not a series of official policies. It was an environment, a set of norms, a collection of signals about what was valued and what was not. What was valued was growth. Specifically, the metric that everything else was subordinated to was customer acquisition. How many new companies were being brought onto the Zenefits platform each week? This metric was tracked obsessively, celebrated loudly, and tied to compensation and status in ways that made it the organizing principle of the organization. Employees whose customer counts were high were heroes. Employees whose customer counts were low were under pressure. The culture was competitive, numbers-driven, and relentless in its focus on the single metric that Conrad had determined was the key to the company's success. What was not valued, or more precisely, what was treated as an obstacle to what was valued, was compliance. The legal and regulatory requirements that attended the insurance brokerage business were processed, in the cultural environment Conrad created, as problems to be managed rather than standards to be met. The people who raised compliance concerns were not celebrated. The people who found ways to move customers through the system quickly, regardless of whether the compliance requirements were fully met, were. The physical environment of the Zenefits office reinforced the culture. The company had moved into a large, open-plan space in San Francisco that was decorated and run with the aesthetic of a startup that was going to change the world. There was free food, free beer on tap, foosball tables, the standard artifacts of the Silicon Valley work as lifestyle culture that was ubiquitous in that era. The environment said, "This is fun, this is exciting, this is the most important thing you will ever work on." The combination of the cultural environment, the compensation tied to growth metrics, and the explicit pressure from leadership to hit targets created conditions in which compliance shortcuts were not just tolerated, but in some cases expected. An employee who was hitting their customer acquisition numbers didn't get asked whether all the compliance boxes had been checked. An employee who was not hitting their numbers because they were waiting for licensing to clear was under pressure to find another way. The stairwell is worth mentioning. Zenefits' San Francisco office reportedly had a stairwell that became, at various points, a location for employee hookups, a detail that sounds salacious and is in many ways not the most important thing about the company's cultural problems, but that became symbolic of a broader question about whether any boundaries were being observed. An HR software company whose internal HR practices were chaotic and boundary-free was either an irony or a warning sign, depending on how you read it. The drinking culture was extensive. The pressure on employees was intense. The attrition was high. The employees who stayed were, in many cases, the ones who were most committed to the growth narrative and least troubled by the ways in which the growth was being achieved. This is the environment in which the licensing software was apparently built, distributed, and used by hundreds of employees. It was not a rogue operation run by a few bad actors. It was, by all accounts, an institutional practice that operated in plain sight within an organizational culture that had decided growth justified the means used to achieve it. And at the top of that culture, setting the tone for everything that flowed from it, was Parker Conrad. One of the more instructive dimensions of the Zenefits story is the contrast between two very different investor stances toward the company. One that funded the growth without adequate scrutiny of how that growth was being achieved, and one that eventually forced the reckoning. Andreessen Horowitz, known universally as A16Z, was Zenefits' lead investor through its most explosive growth phases. The firm was, and remains, one of the most prestigious and most analytically sophisticated venture capital operations in Silicon Valley. Its partners have decades of experience evaluating startups, identifying the ones that will succeed, and understanding the patterns of failure that separate sustainable growth from fragile hype. The firm's investment in Zenefits and the valuations it led through multiple rounds requires examination. The growth numbers that Zenefits was producing were genuine in the sense that customers were genuinely being added at the rates claimed. The platform was growing, the revenue was growing, the customer count was growing. The growth was real. The question that A16Z's due diligence was not adequately asking, or was asking and not adequately answering, was how the growth was being achieved. Specifically, whether the insurance brokerage activity that was generating Zenefits' revenue was being conducted by licensed individuals who had completed the required training. The answer to that question, had it been adequately investigated at any point during the explosive growth phase, would have been alarming. But venture capital due diligence is not primarily focused on regulatory compliance, in the way that, say, a bank examination is. Investors at the growth stage are evaluating the market opportunity, the team quality, the product market fit, the competitive dynamics, and the financial metrics. Regulatory compliance in a specific line of business area is typically assessed at a high level. Is the business legal? Rather than, are all employees who are conducting regulated activities properly licensed? The former question produces a satisfactory answer in the Zenefits case. The latter would have produced a very different one. The board dynamics at Zenefits during this period are relevant. A16Z's partner Ben Horowitz was on Zenefits' board. The board was receiving reports about the company's performance and presumably had some visibility into the operational practices that were generating that performance. The question of what the board knew and when it knew it about the licensing shortcut is one that the legal proceedings and internal investigations have partially illuminated, without fully resolving the question of whether the board-level oversight was adequate given the scale of the regulatory violations occurring. The investor who forced the reckoning was not from the outside. It was the board itself. Specifically, after the regulatory investigations began to surface and it became clear that the compliance problems were systemic and serious. At that point, the board commissioned the forensic investigation that confirmed the scale of the licensing fraud, and it was that investigation's findings that created the conditions for what came next. But there is a second investor story here that deserves its own section. The story of Fidelity Investments, which had invested in Zenefits at a late stage. In late 2015, Fidelity marked down its Zenefits investment by roughly 48%, a significant reduction that was not accompanied by a public explanation, but that signaled that a large, sophisticated institutional investor had independently assessed that the $4.5 billion valuation was not supportable. The markdown, when it became public, was one of the first visible cracks in the story Zenefits had been telling about itself. The story was about to crack much more publicly. The sequence of events that brought Zenefits' licensing practices into public view began not with a whistleblower or a journalist, but with the regulatory apparatus of the insurance industry, specifically the California Department of Insurance, which had been receiving signals about Zenefits' compliance practices for some time before it acted. Insurance regulation in the United States is, in practice, carried out by state regulators who have limited resources and face the challenge of overseeing an enormous industry with relatively modest enforcement budgets. The California Department of Insurance, while better resourced than many state equivalents, was not monitoring Zenefits' every transaction. What it was doing was responding to complaints and concerns as they arose, and concerns about Zenefits' licensing practices were arising, from competitors, from traditional insurance brokers who had been losing business to the startup, and from individuals within the industry who had observed practices that seemed inconsistent with the licensing requirements. The specific investigation that eventually produced formal regulatory consequences was preceded by a period during which Zenefits' compliance issues were known within the company at levels above the individual employees using the training bypass software. Internal emails and communications that were later reviewed in the course of investigations showed that senior figures at Zenefits were aware of the compliance problems and were managing them, not through remediation, but through a combination of minimization and continued operation. The board's forensic investigation, commissioned after the regulatory scrutiny intensified, was the moment of internal reckoning. The investigation was conducted by outside counsel and produced findings that the board then had to process in real time. A significant number of employees had obtained or renewed insurance licenses through a process that involved the training bypass software. The number was not small. The states involved were not few. The practice was not isolated to a specific team or period. It was systemic. What made the internal investigation's findings particularly difficult to manage was the question of attribution. Who had built the bypass software? Who had distributed it? Who had decided that it would be used? The answers to these questions pointed upward in the organization in ways that created obvious implications for executive accountability. Parker Conrad's position in the weeks following the forensic investigation's findings becoming clear to the board became increasingly untenable. The compliance violations were not the product of rogue employees acting against company policy. They were the product of a culture that Conrad had created and an operational practice that had apparently been known at senior levels of the organization. In February 2016, Parker Conrad resigned as CEO of Zenefits. The announcement was handled with the careful language of corporate transitions. He was stepping down to pursue other opportunities. The company was in good hands with new leadership. The best was yet to come. The language concealed the reality. Conrad was resigning because the board had concluded that his continued presence was incompatible with the company's ability to address the regulatory consequences of practices that had flourished under his leadership. The irony of the resignation, of the founder of an HR software company resigning in circumstances that would have required careful handling by any HR department, was not lost on observers. The company that was supposed to make HR easy could not manage its own. And the morning after Conrad resigned, a memo landed in every Zenefits employee's inbox that would become one of the most widely read internal documents in startup history. David Sachs, who had been a co-founder of PayPal, had worked as an executive at a number of technology companies and was known in Silicon Valley as a sharp operational mind, was brought in as Zenefits' new CEO following Conrad's departure. He was, in the parlance of startup turnarounds, a fix-it executive, someone with the experience and the willingness to do the uncomfortable work of assessing what had gone wrong and taking the steps necessary to address it. Within days of his appointment, Sachs sent a company-wide memo that was, by the standards of corporate internal communication, startlingly direct. The memo described, in unusually frank terms, the scale of the compliance problems and the cultural conditions that had produced them. It did not use euphemisms. It did not soften the conclusions. It laid out what had happened in language that reflected Sachs's apparent belief that the company's employees deserved an honest account of the situation they were in. The memo made headlines when it leaked, as all significant internal memos at high-profile startups eventually do. The coverage focused inevitably on some of its more colorful elements. Sachs described a culture in which employees were having sex in stairwells and getting drunk at work, using language that was vivid enough to produce the kind of media coverage that a struggling company navigating regulatory investigations could have done without. These details, while real, were the surface-level symptoms of the cultural problem, rather than its core. The core of what Sachs was describing was the compliance culture failure. A company that had been running so fast, in a direction determined so absolutely by a single metric, that it had lost the ability to recognize when it was doing something wrong. Not just the licensing shortcut, but the broader pattern of cutting corners, of treating regulatory requirements as obstacles rather than standards, of building an organizational culture in which the people who raised compliance concerns were a drag on the growth that the organization had decided was its primary value. Sachs outlined a remediation plan. Zenefits would come into compliance, genuinely, completely, verifiably. Employees who had been operating without proper licenses would be identified and either licensed properly or moved into roles that did not require licensure. The bypass software would be eliminated. The company would cooperate with state regulators and accept the consequences of what had happened. The culture would be restructured around values that included compliance, not just growth. The plan was credible on paper. Its execution would require the company to operate, at least temporarily, more slowly, because genuine compliance required genuine training, which took time, which meant the growth rate would decline while the remediation was underway. For a company that had been defined by its growth rate, that had raised capital at valuations premised on that growth rate continuing, and that had a board and investor base that had committed to the story of hypergrowth, slowing down was not just an operational adjustment, it was a crisis of identity. And the financial consequences of that identity crisis were about to become very concrete. The regulatory investigations that followed Zenefits' public acknowledgement of the licensing compliance problems were, by design, conducted at the state level, because insurance regulation is state-level jurisdiction. This meant that Zenefits faced not a single federal investigation with a single resolution, but a state-by-state process that required engagement with 50 different regulatory bodies, each with its own timeline, its own investigators, and its own penalty framework. The Washington State Office of the Insurance Commissioner moved first and most aggressively. Washington's investigation produced findings that the company had approximately 83 employees who had sold or attempted to sell health insurance in Washington without proper licensure. The state's response was significant. Zenefits was ordered to pay a fine of $7 million, at the time the largest insurance-related fine in Washington state history, and to restructure its Washington operations to ensure genuine compliance going forward. The $7 million fine was, in the context of a company that had raised over $580 million, not financially devastating in isolation. But its significance was not the dollar amount. It was the precedent it set for the multi-state regulatory process that followed. A $7 million fine from one state signaled that other states were likely to produce similar or larger findings, creating an aggregate regulatory liability of potentially significant scale. It also created public documentation of the compliance failures that made subsequent denials or minimizations difficult. California's investigation produced additional penalties. Other states followed. The total regulatory cost of the licensing violations across all the state investigations ran into the tens of millions of dollars. More importantly, the remediation requirements, the changes to operations and training processes that regulators demanded as conditions of continued operation, imposed ongoing compliance costs that fundamentally changed the unit economics of the business. The business model that Zenefits had been running, giving away HR software to acquire customers cheaply and then generating revenue from insurance commissions, depended on the efficiency of that customer acquisition process. The speed with which Zenefits could onboard new customers and begin generating commissions was central to the model's economics. When genuine compliance requirements were applied, when employees actually had to complete the required training, actually had to pass the required exams, actually had to obtain proper licensure before conducting brokerage activity, the speed of the onboarding process declined significantly. Slower onboarding meant a longer path to revenue from each customer. A longer path to revenue meant the economics that had produced the $4.5 billion valuation were no longer supportable. The valuation, which had been premised on a growth trajectory that assumed the company's operating model was sustainable, began to collapse. The fidelity markdown had been the first visible sign. Internal discussions about the appropriate valuation, in light of the regulatory findings and the remediation requirements, produced numbers dramatically lower than the fundraising era peaks. By the end of 2016 and into 2017, Zenefits had reduced its headcount by more than half through layoffs. The company that had been adding employees as fast as it could hire them, that had been celebrated for its growth, that had been a symbol of what the startup model could achieve, was now reducing its workforce, lowering its valuation, and conducting the difficult and unglamorous work of genuine compliance. The growth machine had been stopped. The question was whether anything was left worth saving. David Sachs's tenure as CEO was, by the standards of turnaround situations, relatively effective in the specific task of addressing the compliance failures. The company did engage with regulators. It did implement genuine licensing and training requirements. It did change the cultural practices that had produced the compliance shortcuts. The structural problems that had caused the violations were, in the operational sense, fixed. The harder question was whether fixing the compliance problems would leave a business that was viable in the competitive landscape that had developed during the years of Zenefits' growth. The HR software market that Zenefits had helped define was, by 2016 and 2017, far more competitive than it had been when the company launched in 2013. The problem Zenefits had identified, the administrative nightmare of small business HR, had attracted significant attention and significant capital from the broader technology industry. Competitors had emerged. Existing players had upgraded their products. The field was crowded. More importantly, some of Zenefits' competitors had been watching the regulatory saga and had built their products and operations with compliance as a foundational requirement rather than an obstacle. These competitors could now claim, accurately, that their compliance practices were sound, a claim that Zenefits had to make carefully against the backdrop of a documented history of compliance failures in ways that required substantial evidence rather than mere assertion. The customer relationships that Zenefits had built during the growth phase were, in many cases, intact. Small businesses that had adopted the platform and found it genuinely useful were not automatically moving to competitors. The product, absent the compliance failures in its execution, was still addressing the problem it had been designed to solve, and it was still solving it reasonably well. But the sales and marketing costs of acquiring new customers without the aggressive cultural practices that had characterized the growth phase were higher than before. The pace of customer acquisition was lower. The unit economics, recalculated without the compliance shortcuts, were more modest. The growth rate, which had been the primary driver of the valuation, was declining. Sachs eventually left the CEO role, replaced by Jay Fulcher, who had a background in enterprise software and brought a more conventionally operational approach to the company's leadership. Under Fulcher, Zenefits continued to operate and continued to improve its compliance standing. The company pivoted its business model somewhat, moving toward a model where the HR software itself was sold for a fee rather than given away entirely for free, a change that reflected the reality that the original free model's economics had depended on operational practices that were no longer available. The company that emerged from the regulatory crisis was smaller, more compliant, more conventionally managed, and operating in a market that had become more competitive in the years during which Zenefits' internal problems had been consuming its leadership attention. It was a real company, doing real business, solving a real problem. but it was no longer the rocket ship that had attracted the $4.5 billion valuation. And Parker Conrad, the man who had built the rocket, was already at work on his next launch. Parker Conrad's story does not end with his resignation from Zenefits. It continues in ways that are, depending on your perspective, either an inspiring example of founder resilience or an uncomfortable illustration of how Silicon Valley processes accountability. In 2016, the same year he resigned from Zenefits, Conrad founded a new company called Rippling. The concept was an evolution of the Zenefits idea, a compound HR and IT management platform that would go beyond benefits and payroll to include device management, application provisioning, and other aspects of workforce administration. A more ambitious, more technically complex version of the problem Zenefits had been trying to solve. The reaction in the venture capital community to Conrad's new company was mixed, but the balance of that mixture was revealing. Some investors who had been burned in the Zenefits saga passed on Rippling, but a sufficient number of investors, including prominent names in Silicon Valley venture capital, decided that the Zenefits situation was a chapter Conrad had learned from, that his insight into the HR software market was genuine and valuable, and that the specific failure mode of Zenefits, the compliance culture, the regulatory shortcuts, was one that a more mature and more self-aware Conrad would not repeat. Rippling raised capital. It grew. It eventually achieved unicorn status itself, valued at billions of dollars. As of recent periods, Rippling is one of the more successful HR and IT management platforms in the market, genuinely used by businesses that find genuine value in it, growing at rates that are impressive even in the competitive landscape of modern HR software. The question that Conrad's return with Rippling raises, and that Silicon Valley asks and answers differently depending on who is asking, is the question of founder accountability and second chances. Conrad's conduct at Zenefits, the culture he created, the compliance practices he presided over, the specific decision to build and deploy software designed to circumvent licensing requirements, caused real harm. It harmed the employees who were operating without proper licenses and who faced individual regulatory exposure as a result. It harmed the small business customers who were being served by unlicensed brokers without their knowledge. It harmed the investors who had committed capital at valuations premised on a growth model that was not sustainable under genuine compliance requirements. Conrad was not criminally charged in connection with the Zenefits compliance failures. He did not, in any formal legal proceeding, admit conduct that constituted fraud. His departure from Zenefits was a resignation, not a firing for cause in the legal sense. He cooperated with investigations. He has spoken, in subsequent years, about the Zenefits experience in terms that acknowledge mistakes were made, though the degree of personal responsibility he has publicly accepted for the specific compliance failures has been a matter of debate. The fact that Rippling has succeeded, and that it appears to have been built with more attention to compliance and governance than its predecessor, supports the case for giving Conrad the opportunity to demonstrate that he learned from the experience. The genuine value that Rippling provides to its customers is real. The fact that the harm caused at Zenefits, to employees, to customers, to investors, was not fully accounted for in any formal proceeding, and that the venture capital ecosystem's primary response to that harm was to fund Conrad's next venture, raises questions about whether the accountability mechanisms available in the startup ecosystem are adequate to the harms these situations produce. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. That tension is what makes Conrad's story genuinely complicated rather than simply illustrative. Let's take inventory. Not of the financial losses or the regulatory fines or the headcount reductions. Those are the visible outcomes. Let's take inventory of the lessons that the Zenefits story was supposed to teach and what the startup ecosystem did with them. The first lesson is about the relationship between growth targets and ethics. Zenefits is the case study for what happens when a single metric, customer acquisition, revenue growth, user count, becomes the organizing value of an organization in a way that subordinates everything else to it. The compliance violations did not happen because the employees who participated in them were unusually dishonest people. They happened because the organizational environment made compliance shortcuts the rational response to the incentives that were in place. When the thing that determines your career trajectory is hitting a number, and the thing standing between you and that number is a compliance requirement, the compliance requirement is in danger.
This lesson was not new when Zenefits demonstrated it, but Zenefits demonstrated it at a scale and in a way that was hard to ignore, because the specific shortcut involved building software to automate the cheating, which left a cleaner documentary trail than the more diffuse cultural shortcuts that organizations typically use when they deprioritize compliance.
The second lesson is about the specific failure mode of the move fast and break things philosophy when applied to regulated industries. The culture that Facebook popularized and that spread across Silicon Valley as a founding principle of the startup era, the idea that speed is virtue, that constraints are obstacles, that the fastest path between ambition and outcome is always preferable, is, in technology products, sometimes workable. A consumer app that has a bug can push an update. A social media platform that makes a bad product decision can iterate. The cost of moving fast and breaking things in these contexts is primarily reputational and operational. In regulated industries, insurance, finance, healthcare, law, the cost is different. The regulations that govern these industries exist because the products and services they cover have significant implications for the well-being of the people who use them. Breaking the rules in insurance brokerage is not a recoverable A/B test. It means real people received advice about their health insurance from individuals who had not been trained to give that advice, in a context where poor advice can mean people end up with coverage gaps that have consequences when they get sick. The third lesson is about what happens when founder authority is unchecked by adequate governance. The compliance violations at Zenefits were known at senior levels of the organization. They persisted over a significant period. They were not addressed internally until external regulatory pressure made them impossible to ignore. The governance structures that existed, the board, the investor oversight, did not produce the intervention that should have happened earlier. This governance failure is not uniquely a Zenefits problem. It is a recurring feature of high-growth, founder-dominated startup governance, in which the founder's authority is treated as nearly unchallengeable, because the founder's vision is what the investors have bet on, and challenging the founder risks disrupting the execution of that vision. The cultural and structural conditions that make founder-CEO governance accountability difficult are well understood and poorly addressed in most startup contexts. The fourth lesson is about the responsibility that venture capital investors bear for the cultures of the companies they fund. When A16Z invested in Zenefits and participated in rounds at valuations premised on its growth rate, it was, at some level, funding the growth rate without adequately scrutinizing the means by which the growth rate was being achieved. This is not a claim that A16Z knew about the licensing bypass software and chose to ignore it. It is a claim that the due diligence process that led to billion-dollar investment decisions did not adequately examine the specific practices through which the company's key metrics were being generated. Venture capital firms have, in the years since Zenefits, increasingly incorporated operational due diligence, examination not just of growth metrics, but of the business practices producing them, into their investment evaluation. Whether this change is sufficient is a question that will be answered by the next case, rather than by intention. The fifth and most uncomfortable lesson is about the specific culture of celebration that the startup world built around growth, and what that culture communicated to the founders and employees operating within it. The coverage of Zenefits during its ascent, the magazine covers, the breathless profiles of Conrad as a visionary disruptor, the celebration of the company's growth rate as evidence of its rightness, created an environment in which the questions that should have been asked were crowded out by the noise of the celebration. The media coverage of fast-growing startups is a participation in their stories in ways that have real effects. The profile that describes a founder as a genius before asking how the numbers were made is not a neutral act of journalism. It is a contribution to the information environment in which investors, employees, customers, and regulators make their decisions. The speed with which that coverage turned once the compliance violations became public, from celebration to critique, was itself revealing. Not of the story changing, but of the story finally being read in full. There is an image from the Zenefits story that has stayed in the cultural memory of Silicon Valley more than the regulatory fines or the valuation collapse. the stairwell. The stories about employees using Zenefits' stairwells for sexual encounters were salacious enough to capture headlines, and the media's focus on them reflected a tendency to process corporate culture failures through the most colorful details, rather than the most consequential ones. The stairwell is memorable. The licensing fraud was more important. But the stairwell and the licensing fraud are expressions of the same thing, an organization that had decided across multiple domains that the normal rules did not apply to it, that the standards by which other organizations operated were constraints for other organizations, that the exceptional speed of its growth, the exceptional importance of its mission, the exceptional quality of its founders and employees, all of these things justified a relationship to rules and standards that was fundamentally more flexible than what was required of ordinary institutions. This relationship to standards, the conviction that exceptional circumstances justify exceptional latitude, is one of the more dangerous features of the startup culture that Zenefits exemplified. It is dangerous not because startups are uniquely amoral, but because the combination of high stakes, high speed, inadequate governance, and a cultural vocabulary that celebrates disruption creates conditions in which the slide from confidence to exemption to violation can happen without any individual making a clearly deliberate decision to do wrong. Parker Conrad did not, in all probability, wake up one morning and decide to commit regulatory fraud. He made a series of decisions about growth targets, about the pace of hiring, about the adequacy of existing compliance processes for the company's operational needs that created conditions in which the bypass software emerged as a solution to a real operational problem. Each decision, at each step, may have seemed manageable and even reasonable within the context of the pressures and the culture he had created. The harm those decisions caused was not manageable or reasonable. The small business customers who were advised by unlicensed brokers deserved better. The employees who used the bypass software and put their own licenses and careers at risk deserved a company that didn't put them in that position. The investors who committed capital at valuations built on a compliance-violating growth model deserved accurate information. The startup world's lesson from Zenefits, to the extent that lessons are absorbed rather than merely acknowledged, is that fast growth and genuine standards are not mutually exclusive, that building a company quickly and building it correctly are not opposites, that the shortcuts that enable faster growth in the short term create the regulatory, reputational, and organizational liabilities that destroy that growth in the medium term. This lesson is not new. It was not discovered by Zenefits. It has been available in every compliance failure, every culture crisis, every startup scandal that preceded and followed this one. The question is whether the people building the next fast-growing company in a regulated industry, sitting in their open plan offices with the beer taps and the growth dashboards and the incredible sense of being in the most important place, doing the most important thing, whether those people are reading the lesson or just reading the headlines. The stairwell or the standard? Every organization chooses, in 1,000 daily decisions, which one it's building toward. Zenefits chose the stairwell, and the standard eventually came to collect. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Every click helps us bring more untold stories into the light. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next Dark Ledger investigation.